two populations, one on the western side of the Atlantic, one in the heart of the ancient world, separated by an ocean, by language, by religion, by centuries of completely different recorded history. And yet when geneticists mapped their DNA and laid the sequences side by side, they found something that nobody in mainstream history class ever told you: a shared genetic signal that traces back to a time when the Sahara was green, when the Arabian Peninsula was a bridge between continents, and when the ancestors of both Black Americans and modern Arab populations were part of the same ancient human story. And the reason most people have never heard of this connection isn't an accident. It's a choice, one made by the same forces that decided which histories get told, which ancestries get celebrated, and which ones get quietly buried. Before we dive in, comment where you are watching from and click subscribe. To understand the connection, you have to start at the beginning, not the beginning of the Arab world or the beginning of Black American history, the beginning of the human species itself. Modern humans, Homo sapiens, evolved in Africa approximately 300,000 years ago. For the vast majority of our species' existence, every human being on Earth was African. Every lineage, every genetic thread, every ancestral path leads back to the same continent. And then, between 60,000 and 70,000 years ago, a group of anatomically modern humans made their way out of Africa. Geneticists have traced the most likely route northward through the Horn of Africa, across the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, a narrow channel of water separating modern-day Eritrea and Djibouti from Yemen, and onto the Arabian Peninsula. That crossing is one of the most consequential events in human history. It is the moment that would eventually produce every non-African population on Earth: Europeans, East Asians, South Asians, Indigenous Americans, Pacific Islanders. Every single one of them descends in the paternal or maternal line from African people who crossed into Arabia tens of thousands of years ago. The Arabian Peninsula at that time was not the desert kingdom it is today. During the last glacial maximum and the subsequent period of climatic fluctuation, Arabia experienced green periods, times when rainfall was sufficient to support rivers, lakes, and grasslands across the interior of the peninsula. The Arabo-Persian Gulf Basin was partially exposed land. The Rub al-Khali, the vast empty quarter desert that covers much of southern Arabia today, was dotted with freshwater lakes. This was a landscape that could sustain human populations, and it did. For tens of thousands of years, Arabia was not a barrier between Africa and the rest of Eurasia. It was a corridor, a bridge, a place where African-descended humans lived, adapted, and eventually dispersed northward and eastward into the rest of the world. In a 2016 study published in the journal Genome Research, led by researchers analyzing the DNA of indigenous Arab populations in Qatar, confirmed something remarkable. It found that contemporary indigenous Arabs, the Bedouin population of the Arabian Peninsula, are among the closest living genetic relatives to those original out-of-Africa migrants. Their DNA carries ancestral signals that predate almost any other non-African population on Earth. The study concluded that indigenous Arabs are descendants of the earliest split from ancient Eurasian populations. In plain English, Arabs genetically are among the oldest non-African human populations in existence, and the African ancestry at the root of their lineage connects through deep time to the same ancestral populations that gave rise to Black Americans' African heritage. But that is only the first layer, because the genetic connection between Arab populations and African ancestry is not just ancient, it is also surprisingly recent and surprisingly large. Studies published in the American Journal of Human Genetics and the journal Molecular Biology and Evolution have found that across the Arabian Peninsula, between 7 and 20% of the genetic ancestry of Arab populations comes from sub-Saharan Africa, not distant, diluted, ancient African ancestry, measurable, traceable, recently arrived sub-Saharan African DNA. In Yemen, some populations carry sub-Saharan African ancestry at levels approaching 20%. In Kuwait, a 2013 genetic study found that among the Bedouin tribal groups, The people considered the most traditionally Arab, the tent-dwelling nomadic tribes who trace their lineage to the Arabian desert, sub-Saharan African ancestry reaches 17% or higher. A 2019 study in molecular biology and evolution that conducted a genome-wide characterization of Arabian Peninsula populations found that the sub-Saharan African genetic input into Western Arabian populations, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, the Bedouin groups, reaches up to 20%. And the researchers noted something important. This African ancestry decreases as you move east across the peninsula toward Oman and the UAE, where South Asian ancestry becomes more prominent instead. The gradient itself tells a story. The closer to Africa, the more African. The corridor of human exchange between East Africa and Arabia has never closed. Now here is where this connects directly to Black Americans. The dominant African ancestry in Black Americans traces to West and Central Africa. The Yoruba, the Igbo, the Wolof, the Bakongo, the Hikan, and related peoples. The transatlantic slave trade drew primarily from the western coastline of Africa, not the Eastern Horn, but the West African populations that are ancestral to Black Americans share a deep genetic connection with East Africa, with the Nile Valley, and with the populations whose DNA flowed across the Bab el-Mandeb into Arabia tens of thousands of years ago. Here's how it works at the level of the Y chromosome, the most common paternal haplogroup in Black American men, carried by the majority of those who trace their ancestry to West Africa, is haplogroup E1b1a, specifically the E-M2 branch. This haplogroup originated in Africa between 41,000 and 73,000 years ago, placing its origin squarely within the time frame of early modern human dispersals. It is the genetic signature of the Bantu expansion, the Yoruba, the Igbo, the Akan, and nearly every major West and Central African ethnic group whose descendants make up the bulk of Black American ancestry. It is, in the deepest sense, the Y chromosome of Black America. Now look at the Arab world. The most dominant paternal haplogroup in Arab men is J1, particularly the JM267 branch, which is the signature of the Arabian Peninsula and the Levant. But here is what the textbooks leave out. Arab populations also carry significant frequencies of haplogroup E, specifically E1b1b, a branch that is closely related to the E found in African Americans, sharing a common ancestor in East Africa tens of thousands of years ago. The E1b1b branch spread from East Africa northward into the Levant, the Horn of Africa, and across the Red Sea into Arabia, carried by populations who were moving along that ancient African-Arabian corridor long before written history began. The E haplogroup family, with E1b1a dominant in West Africa and its Black American descendants, and E1b1b present at measurable frequencies in the Levant, North Africa, and the Arabian Peninsula, represents two branches of the same ancient African tree. They share a common African ancestor. They diverged tens of thousands of years ago along different migration pathways. And today, one branch lives inside the chromosomes of Black Americans, and the other lives inside the chromosomes of Arab men across the Middle East. A study published in PMC on the history of African gene flow into the Levant found that Arab populations, Palestinians, Jordanians, Syrians, Iraqis, and Bedouin carry 10 to 15% of mitochondrial lineages that trace directly to sub-Saharan Africa. The Yemen Hadramaut region, sitting at the junction of Arabia and East Africa, carries the highest frequency of all, up to 35% of maternal lineages with direct sub-Saharan African origin. These are not traces. These are not statistical noise. These are major population level signals. If you've made it this far, subscribe. Every video we publish is built directly from peer-reviewed science. No speculation, no mythology, just the genome telling the truth. You won't find this combination anywhere else. Now let's talk about the part that most people in both the Arab world and in Black America have been specifically discouraged from knowing. Between the 7th century CE and the early 20th century, the Arab slave trade moved an estimated 10 to 18 million Africans out of East Africa, West Africa, and across the Sahara into the Arab world. Scholars have described it as the longest slave trade in recorded history, spanning 13 centuries compared to the 4 centuries of the transatlantic trade. The Arab slave trade is not a footnote, it is one of the largest forced human migration in history, and it left genetic consequences that are still visible in Arab DNA today. The sub-Saharan African mitochondrial lineages found at 10 to 15% frequency in Levantine Arab populations, the 17 to 20% African ancestry in Bedouin and Yemeni groups, the African haplogroups detected in Saudi Arabian Y chromosomes, much of this arrived through that millennium-long movement of enslaved Africans. A study published in PMC tracking the trans-Saharan slave trade using mitochondrial DNA found clear and measurable African genetic signals in North African and Arab populations that align precisely with the documented slave trade routes from West Africa across the Sahara to the Maghreb in the Middle East, and from East Africa by Dow across the Red Sea to the Arabian Peninsula and the Gulf. The enslaved people who were taken east toward Arabia, toward Persia, toward the Levant, were the genetic cousins of the people who were taken west toward the Americas. Black Americans and Arabs share African ancestry in part because the same continent supplied both directions of the same catastrophic human trade. One branch of the African diaspora went to the New World, another branch went to the Arab world. They were ripped from the same root, but here is the layer that goes deeper still. Because this connection is not only about the slave trade, it predates it by thousands of years. Geneticists studying ancient DNA from the Nile Valley, from the Horn of Africa, and from the Levant have found evidence of repeated, ancient back and forth movement between Africa and the Near East. Not one directional, not simply out of Africa. Movement in both directions, across tens of thousands of years, creating a genetic corridor between the African interior and the population that would eventually become the Arab world. A study published in Science in 2015 sequenced the genome of a 4,500-year-old Ethiopian man found in Moda Cave. His DNA showed no Eurasian ancestry whatsoever. He was purely African. But modern East Africans, who are descended from the same ancestral populations, show clear evidence of Eurasian genetic ancestry that arrived sometime between 2,000 and 3,500 years ago. That Eurasian ancestry, the researchers found, came from a population closely related to early Neolithic farmers of the Levant, people whose descendants would eventually become part of the Arab world. The Nile River itself functioned as a genetic highway for tens of thousands of years. A 2005 genetic study found that populations in Somalia, Sudan, Egypt, and the Oromo of Ethiopia all shared the same Y chromosome haplogroup, E3b1, defined by E-M78, suggesting continuous genetic exchange along the Nile corridor connecting East Africa to the populations of Northeast Africa and the Middle East. The ancient Natufians, the Epipaleolithic hunter-gatherers of the Levant, whose DNA shows up as a major ancestral component in modern Arab populations, themselves carried East African genetic ancestry. A 2018 reanalysis of Natufian remains found that they harbored approximately 6.8% ancestry from an East African source population, likely introduced through the same Bab el-Mandeb corridor that connected the Horn of Africa to Arabia. Africa and the Arab world have been exchanging genes since before history had a name for either of them. Now let's bring it to the individual level, because for Black Americans specifically, this connection has a particular dimension that even most DNA companies haven't explained clearly. When a Black American takes a DNA test today and receives results showing Middle Eastern or North African ancestry, a result that appears for a measurable percentage of Black American test takers, there are potentially multiple explanations. Some of it may trace to the Moorish period in West Africa, when Arab and Berber scholars, traders, and clerics traveled south of the Sahara and intermarried with West African populations for centuries. The Mali Empire, the Songhai Empire, the Kanem-Bornu Empire. These were all West African civilizations, with active and sustained contact with the Arab and Berber worlds across the trans-Saharan trade routes. Timbuktu was not just a mythical destination, it was a real city of 100,000 people, home to one of the world's great universities, where West African and Arab intellectual traditions merged for generations. The people of those civilizations intermarried. Their children carried genes from both worlds, and some of those genes, diluted by centuries, traveled west on slave ships and survive today in Black American DNA. Some of the Middle Eastern signal may trace to the ancient Eurasian back migration into East Africa that eventually spread westward into West African populations. Some of it may trace to the trans-Saharan slave trade, which moved people and genes in all directions across 1,000 years. And some of it reflects something even deeper, the shared ancient African ancestry that both Black Americans and Arab populations inherited from the same ancestral source. Populations that lived in Africa hundreds of thousands of years ago, before the first human being ever crossed the Bab el-Mandeb, before the Sahara was a desert, before the Arabian Peninsula was anything other than the first stop on humanity's long walk out of Africa. Geneticists at the University of Maryland, studying genome-wide variation across West African and Near Eastern populations, have noted what they describe as a distinctive ancient Eurasian component present at low but measurable levels in some West African populations, particularly the Yoruba and related groups of Nigeria. This component is not explained by recent Arab contact. Its age, estimated by the rate of genetic recombination, suggests it arrived between 7,500 and 10,500 years ago. Before Islam, before the Arab identity as we know it existed, before the Sahara had finished drying into the barrier it is today. So what has been erased, and by whom? The erasure operates on multiple levels, and it is not purely intentional, though some of it is. At one level, it is the result of political boundaries. The modern Arab world and the modern African American community are separated by geography, religion, language, and political identity in ways that make the genetic continuity invisible to casual observation. People see difference on the surface and assume difference all the way down. At another level, the erasure is the product of the Arab slave trade's own legacy. Unlike the transatlantic slave trade, which created a massive, geographically bounded African diaspora that maintained a distinct identity in the Americas, the Arab slave trade largely absorbed its African captives into Arab societies. African men enslaved in the Arab world were disproportionately castrated, a deliberate practice documented by historians across multiple centuries, which meant their genetic lineage was terminated. African women were taken as concubines, and their children, in many cases, were integrated into Arab families with their African origins downplayed or erased. The result is that the African ancestry in Arab populations often goes unacknowledged within those communities themselves. Arab identity in the modern world is constructed around language, religion, and shared civilization, not around the African genetic heritage that runs through a significant portion of Arabian DNA. And in the United States, the story told about Black American ancestry is almost entirely framed around the transatlantic slave trade and its West African origins. That framing is correct and important, but it omits the deeper, older African story, the one that connects West African DNA through the ancient Nile corridor to the Levant, through the Bab el-Mandeb to the Arabian Peninsula, and into the genetic structure of the Arab world. The genome connects these two populations across thousands of years of shared history. The history books built walls between them that the DNA simply does not recognize. Here is what the science has established. In plain terms, Arab populations carry 7 to 20% sub-Saharan African ancestry, with the highest concentrations in Yemen, among Bedouin groups, and in populations closest to the African coast. That African ancestry arrived through two channels: the ancient out-of-Africa migration and its subsequent back-and-forth movements across the Bab el-Mandeb corridor, and the 13th century Arab slave trade that moved millions of East and West Africans into the Arab world. Black Americans carry primarily West and Central African ancestry, with additional layers from the European colonial period. But the West African populations at the root of Black American DNA share deep ancestral connections through the ancient Nile corridor, through the haplogroup E family of paternal lineages, through the Eurasian back migration that touched West Africa between 7,500 and 10,500 years ago, with the populations that gave rise to the ancient Near East and eventually to the Arab world. The thread between these two populations is not a modern invention. It is not a political argument. It is written in base pairs, in haplogroups, in recombination rates measured by the Broad Institute, the University of Pennsylvania, Oxford University, and research teams across 4 continents. It is tens of thousands of years old. It survived the transatlantic slave trade, the Arab slave trade, the drawing of colonial borders across Africa, the construction of racial categories in the modern West, and every other human attempt to divide what the genome insists on keeping connected. The ancient connection between Black Americans and the Arab world was never lost. It was only hidden from the people who carry it. Hidden by the construction of racial categories that define African and Arab as opposites when the genome sees them as relatives. Hidden by the erasure of the Arab slave trade from the global conversation about African history. Hidden by the political identities that both communities have built, necessarily, understandably, around the histories of their oppression rather than the deeper story of their shared origins. Hidden by a world that found it more convenient to keep these two communities looking at each other across a wall of difference rather than recognizing the ancient bridge of blood that the science has now made undeniable. The DNA always knew. Now you do too. If this video moves something in you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe for more.